This upload was previously deleted by YouTube. You can find it at therighttoreason.com, patreon.com/right. You can find it on iTunes, PodBean, Stitcher. It's all over the place in podcast format. But I didn't want those of you that catch the show just through YouTube to be denied this episode. I also didn't like the idea of trying to make it seem like YouTube hasn't edited my content. And this is something that a lot of content creators are experiencing right now, is the restrictive control of YouTube. So I thought it would be appropriate that each time that YouTube did edit my content, I would just say, YouTube edit. So here's the episode. I really enjoyed it. And if you want to hear it unedited in its full intended version, once again, you can find it at patreon.com/right or at therighttoreason.com. Thanks. This is the Right to Reason podcast, and I'm your host, Robert Stanley. Today we're going to be talking to Emmy and Peabody award-winning director Eugene Jarecki. He won the Grand Jury Prize at the Sundance Film Festival for Why We Fight, and again for The House We Live In. He recently released the film The King. Eugene takes Elvis Presley's 1963 Rolls-Royce on a music trip across America. The journey traces the rise and fall of Elvis as a metaphor for the country he left behind. This is a penetrating and sobering look at the American dream. I promise you, you will come away from this with a new perspective about your country. I know I have. This has changed me. It's my job to share that with you.
Oh, that's Elvis's? That's actually his Rolls Royce.
Damn straight it is.
Oh my God.
The king sat in this car.
I feel like Elvis Presley left a spirit that inspires me.
Now, this is amazing.
You have no idea how hard he hit American culture.
I wonder if you could help me. I was trying to find the house that Elvis Presley lived in.
Ain't had no house over here. You remember the great Chuck D line?
Elvis was a hero to most, but he never meant to me. Straight up racist, that sucker was simple and plain. Mother him and John Wayne.
Let's do this.
You ain't nothing but
The thing that Elvis had, it was black and it was white. It was all mixed up together.
He was the voice of the country at its best and at its worst.
America is great when America does great things. Well, America's been doing a lot of bad things.
I think that the American dream was always someone's fantasy and someone else's drunken nightmare.
Oh, make us sad, make us sad.
That's where we are in America. We're in the second act, where it's just all gone to hell.
What is wrong with America?
The world just doesn't know where America is headed. Where does the country go from here?
Then I went to the well.
He said, I recognize that I'm self-destructive.
I thought he only drove American cars.
I only had one trick on my sleeve. I sing it over and over.
If Elvis is your metaphor for America, we're about to OD.
Till she come back to me.
It's the Right to Reason podcast.
This content has been edited by YouTube. Find the full unedited version at therighttoreason.com.
My name is Eugene Jarecki. I'm the director of the new film The King about Elvis Presley and the American Dream, and you're listening to The Right to Reason because you have the right to reason. Use it.
YouTube edit.
This episode of the Right to Reason podcast is brought to you by our patrons and contributors like me. We have all recognized the value of the unrestrained marketplace of ideas and have decided to make a difference. You can make a difference too. Contribute at patreon.com/right and learn more about your right to reason at therighttoreason.com. Your activism is appreciated.
YouTube edit. Right off the bat, I gotta tell you, man, I loved the sound. Being inside that car seemed to make the sound of all the music that was being played just so much better. I felt like I was right there, and a lot of the listeners right now are going, Robert, what the hell are you talking about? In case they haven't seen the film yet, it's probably playing in your area or within a major city nearby. Eugene, can you kind of catch them up to speed so that I don't sound so crazy to them right now?
Sure. Well, you know, thanks for saying so. We took Elvis Presley's 1963 Rolls-Royce across America, and to really sort of travel through today's America along the milestones of Elvis's own life and career. And what that meant was a tour through modern-day America haunted by the past, and that meant that we would get to see sort of how the other half of our sense of ourselves is doing in this moment in history. So there's no way to, you know, you start with Elvis Presley and then you drive across the country. So naturally, the people who jumped in the car were all manner of Americans, everyday people, famous people, and people wanted to tell their stories. They wanted to kind of go down memory lane at times, but a lot of times they wanted to tell us about today. And many of the people who did that did so in song, you know, famous musicians and non-famous musicians playing in that car. And in many ways, the sound of it and the music of it is sort of the poetry of I think, sort of a persistent American spirit, this flickering flame that no matter what you throw against it, kind of doesn't go out. Wherever you go, America or otherwise, you're just seeing people with their artistry and their inspiration shouting out in a way with passion, the very spirit that I don't believe that capitalism can extinguish. But I think capitalism is trying its hardest, because it enslaves people, it commodifies people, it turns everything into a product, it reduces the human experience to something almost like a psychology experiment of rats. And the people in the back of the car are the opposite of that. They are deeply human, deeply talented, majestic American creatures who remind us of what we've got in our arsenal to go up against those dark forces.
I'm asleep here. This song, is called Danny Ray. This is another song me and my mom wrote. Heading down to Baton Rouge, chasing my warrior mind. I'm heading down to Baton Rouge. Maybe I go tonight. Maybe I go tonight. Been here in Knoxville town with my Danny Ray. Forgot how Louisiana feels in the month of May. In the month of May. Ba-zibbity-ba-ba-da-bow, ba-da-ba-da-bow, ba-zibbity-ba-ba-da-bow, bow, oh.
Because Elvis Presley represents something so beautiful, so poetic about what we thought the American dream was and what we want it to be. And yet at the same time, of course, we're living at a time right now where a lot of Americans feel deeply challenged in who we are. We feel very unsure about the meaning of this country and what we're going to be. Are we just going to be this kind of runaway capitalist cutthroat experiment, or are we going to sort of choose democracy up and spits it out, or are we going to hold strong to our first principles and exert the kind of resistance needed to keep anti-democratic forces in check?
Rest us by like cafe, on Big Easy, rock me sleep. Now Big Easy, rock me sleep.
You know, I grew up in a very, very Christian fundamentalist home. Secular music wasn't really something that was accepted. Pastor's house, you know what I mean? We were Southern, though. And one thing that really just somehow it broke through the mold was Elvis Presley's music. We had a record player. Not a lot of millennials grew up with a record player, but we had one. And I remember my mother playing Elvis Presley while she cleaned the house. I mean, his music means a lot to me. YouTube edit. But then secretly I'm listening to Public Enemy and I'm hearing Elvis Presley and John Wayne are racist.
Elvis was a hero to most, but he never meant shit to me. If he's straight out racist, the sucker was simple and plain. Motherfucking in John Wayne. 'Cause I'm black and I'm proud already.
And I don't know if they're a racist or not. I'd love to pick your brain about that. But would you at least say that maybe Elvis was responsible for cultural appropriation?
Well, I think that's one of the big debates in the film is this question of cultural appropriation. And I think the film makes a major step that has not been made before in cinema to deal with what we should think of cultural appropriation and what we should think of the question of whether Elvis was a racist or not. Chuck D is in the film and does an incredible job of, he's just a brilliant human being, and he does an amazing job of explaining what he meant by the charge of racism against Elvis. And one of the things he stipulates right away is one of the things he didn't mean was that Elvis stole black music. Chuck D recognizes that Elvis Presley was a poor white kid coming out of roots with poor black people. He was deeply marinated in the black experience, and what came out of that was an authentic sense of blackness. And when he did that, it was a very courageous thing for a white kid in the 1950s to do, to come out of nowhere and be willing to play the music of the black community. You could have gotten lynched for doing something like that. And so at that moment, he's a hero. He's to be deeply celebrated. Questions of racism are really about the institutional racism of the white music industry, and the way in which that white music industry has stolen from black people and given the praise and the money and the kudos and the possibilities to white people, and Elvis is symbolic of that. But it's not Elvis's doing at that point. At that point, Elvis is actually our hero in the story, whose career is being hijacked and instrumentalized to be a kind of white theft against black people. But it's not his effect, in my view, to be fair to him. There are charges of racism, or certainly of participation in racism. But as Chuck D points out, culture is culture. We're supposed to promote people who play each other's music and share each other's food. And that would make a much more peaceable world if we had such a thing. And instead, you don't want to go along saying, hey, you see that African-American kid playing Beethoven? Well, he shouldn't play that because he doesn't have German roots, says Chuck D. He says, you would never say that. Well, likewise, you don't want to tell Elvis Presley not to play black music.
YouTube edit.
But then the question is, what happens after that, when the music industry steps in and takes this incredibly authentic artist and uses him as an instrument for theft?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Exactly.
If you told a black kid not to play Beethoven, you're racist. If you tell Elvis not to play black music, you're racist. What he and the African-American hypothetical kid are doing is sharing culture. And if we all shared culture more, there'd be a lot less war, a lot more peaceful getting along between people. We want to promote that in the world. So we don't want to have a wrong charge of racism. Where Elvis comes into the sights of Chuck D and Van Jones in the film, in terms of racial concerns, is later on in his career, when the black community really needed all the help it could get in the civil rights movement. And they got it from Marlon Brando. They got it from Jane Fonda. They got it from Harry Belafonte and others who went with him to stand up for black rights in the civil rights movement, but they didn't get it from Elvis. On a personal level, it's been made clear to me by a lot of people who knew Elvis, African-Americans and non-African-Americans, that Elvis was deeply connected to the African-American friendships he had in the music industry and outside. He took incredible care of black people who worked for him. He had a very soft sense for the black community. That goes without saying. It's where he came from. What I think is of concern is that at a public level, as a public figure, he didn't really step up when the black community needed him, when the anti-war community needed him. And that's a very fair charge. What I would say in defense of Elvis at that point, because it's a worthy conversation in both directions, really comes from Emmy Lou Harris in the film, who says, listen, to be fair, all of this happened to Elvis, and he was the first person to whom it had happened. Nobody had gone through this kind of thing before. And so you have to give him some benefit of the doubt here, that he's a country boy. He's been signed up with the U.S. military to be effectively the face of the new American military empire. And now you're asking him to speak out against the Vietnam War, and he was just in uniform. And how's he supposed to handle that? People today don't know how to handle that. And I think criticism is warranted. It's really criticism of ourselves today. What are we doing when we're faced with the kind of wars we're involved in? What are we doing about our engagement in Syria? What are we doing about the current president's saber-rattling with Iran? What are we doing about so many engagements around the world in which America is supporting the criminal activities of despotic leaders, the warring activities of countries hurting their own people, etc.? So before we look at Elvis Presley and cast an easy stone, there's a lesson in the choice that faced him, and maybe we're disappointed that he didn't step up. But if we are, then let's fix it in ourselves.
Yeah, it's almost like he was totally vacant. To kind of pick up where you left off there, he was vacant during the whole civil rights movement. And it almost feels like the message I got from your film is like, this almost represents low voter turnout in America, our lack of activism. It's like we are Elvis in a way. You know what I mean? Like his progress throughout your film is indicative and metaphorical of America's fallout, as it were. And I worry where we're headed.
Well, I think that Elvis was a canary in the coal mine. Elvis was the figure whose demise we should have looked at and understood. If a figure that we love as much as him, somebody of such purity and somebody of such beauty, can have been chopped up and beaten to a pulp by the capitalism of the music and movie industries, if we watched Elvis lose everything that was authentic and beautiful about him to this bloated, confused, vulgarized Vegas victim who had been beaten up by the movie industry and turned into a B-movie has-been, who had been beaten up by Las Vegas and turned into the kind of Michael Jackson tragedy of overperforming for the almighty dollar, then we should have known that the country would be soon to follow, that Elvis was just an indicator of what capitalism was designed to do to democracy itself, that the authenticity of Elvis as an artist is analogous to the authenticity of the American people and the American dream itself. The American dream was never perfect, but it was an idea, and it was an idea that somebody could come from nowhere and reach the stars. But the problem is here that when a country boy like Elvis becomes a king, it's one thing to reach for the stars, it's one thing to be successful, it's one thing to be beautiful and loved and adored. It's a whole other thing to take on regal status. Because when you become a king, you drop everything that was great about you, which was that you were an amazing country boy. You leave it behind you. You buy the Rolls Royce, you get lost in the back seat, you start taking all manner of quick fix drug or consumption or addiction to deal with confusions of who you are. And, that car, I always get the feeling Elvis was always looking out the window trying to get back to Tupelo. That car was headed for Vegas and the depths beyond that. I think, next stop is the cemetery with a car like that.
Jesus. That's heavy, man. You set me back on that. I hear you.
And that's the American story. I mean, I could have taken a Cadillac. I could have taken a Thunderbird, right?
Yeah.
But I took the Rolls Royce because the Cadillac and the Thunderbird are part of the Kool-Aid we drink about the past. The 50s were so great. The candy-colored cars and the blue sky. Right. And Jim Crow and the oppression of women and basically the continuation of slavery by another name. Oh, yeah. And the atom bomb and us moving, Pacific Islanders off of the place where they live so we can bomb the next island and accidentally irradiate them. Go see Atomic Cafe for that. I mean, it was a time of experimentation on people. It was a time of Cold War espionage. It was a time of the communist witch hunts. I mean, every single thing that's going on at that time gives the white picket fence a bit of a question mark. And so Elvis is along for the ride with that, and he doesn't mean to be. He's part of the beauty. The beauty was there. Those things I just named are all amazing. The candy-colored cars are amazing. The blue sky of Big Sky Country is amazing. The 50s music is amazing. It's all great. Try telling black people in the 50s what a great American dream they're having. Or Native American people, bring them back from the dead and tell them how lovely it is in the 1950s, if only they could see it. Rather than living on reservations in the 1950s, wasting away in the post-Native American, in what had been their world. They are now stepchildren and marginalized into the depths of poverty, reservation, etc. So, in other words, I didn't want to take a machine that would be an American dream machine and confuse us about that and drink more Kool-Aid. I don't want to do that. I want to take the car that is the ultimate expression of that misdirection, and that's the Rolls. Car fit for a king.
Yeah, it's like when I saw the film, I kind of felt, how do I say, it's like you're holding a mirror at America and saying, see yourself for what it is.
So we're riding around in Soulsville in Elvis Presley's Rolls Royce. Kind of makes you think about the impact that he had, man, not only on Memphis, but the rest of the world. And really, what Memphis's impact was on Elvis. Actually, we're about to pass Aretha Franklin's house.
We are? Where's that?
I think it's up here on the left.
Aretha Franklin's house?
Yeah.
You make me wonder, how can America...
Oh, that's it. That's Aretha Franklin's.
...change?
For 5 years, I thought you were my man. But I found out I'm just a link in your chain.
Eugene, it almost feels like it's too late.
I nothing but a fool. You treated me mean. Oh, you treated me cruel. Change, 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 chain of fool. Every chain has got a weak link. I might be weak, child.
While you were making this critique on American materialism and how, as you kind of show that we are losing our way in a way, Donald Trump, like right while you're making the film, Donald Trump is elected president of the United States of America. Like, how did this hit you, man? Like, how did you deal with that? Like, in some ways, it feels gross to say this. All right, give me a break here, Eugene. Give me a grain of salt. I'm sorry, but it almost feels a vile thing to say, but it's like, hey, that's gonna really sell.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But that's the thing you're talking about. Ironically, that's the materialistic notion.
Yeah, we
you
look
know
at
what I mean?
something that's tragic for the country and the world, and we think, boy, this is really going to be good for my movie's box office. You know, it's crass, but I understand the thought, and believe me, a lot of people said that to me when the election happened. Really? I don't use the current person in the Oval Office's name because I don't like to promote that kind of brand, but I would say that when we were first making the film and that person had not announced an intention for the White House, I was making the same film I've made. I was making a film about a democracy gone wrong that needed desperate intervention against the power and the money. It's an addiction, and it's destroying, it's destroying everything. So I think the real issue is that when that happened, it really caused a seismic shift where I had to then deal with, wow, this is a new and different force. How do I deal with this, and how do I incorporate this into my narrative? And we just had to keep on and make the film we were making and understand that this development was just an explosion of what had been in the works for so long.
YouTube edit. Throughout the film, you were referencing the Colonel, and anyone that's listening that hasn't had the opportunity to see your film yet, and by the way, to the listener, it's likely playing within your area or within your city. Check your local listings. The Colonel, I kind of got the vibe like he represents capitalism in a way.
Well, he was a carnival barker, and he was a sort of a singular kind of manager at the time who was able to launch Elvis into a career of money making that was unprecedented by any artist in the music business in America. But quite less known is that he took 50% as a management fee. So he took half of everything Elvis ever made. And people look back on that now where, managers take, 10%, 5%, 15%. 50% is unheard of, but it was 50% of the moon. And it's a quite complicated situation because Elvis was really seduced by that. And in many ways, sort of it was in his capitalistic interest. It just may not have been in his spiritual interest, because what I think the Colonel represents is the placing of money and power as priorities above all else. And in Elvis's case, it was placed ahead of his artistic authenticity. He sold Elvis out, made him into a cheesy B-movie actor when he could have had an incredibly dignified career alongside people like Brando. It turned him into a Vegas performing artist rather than an artist who could choose his incredible tour locations and make a splash of himself all over the country he loved. He ended up sort of quarantining him in that city of sin and soullessness. So capitalism as embodied in the Colonel is a soulless, soul-crushing force.
I went to the doctor and I said, "Doctor, please, what do you do when your true love leaves?" He said, "The hardest thing in the world to do is to find somebody who believes in you."
As a kid and in the beginning of his career, for Elvis, going west was a dream.
Go make a sad song.
Like, isn't it interesting that right when he was changing the world with music, some part of him wanted to be an actor?
Cars, beaches, stars on the sidewalk. To me, that's LA. The illusion of America, like all wrapped into one big commercial.
Then I went to the whippoorwill, I said, "Whippoorwill, please, What do you do when your true love leaves?
So the Colonel signs him up to the biggest movie contract in the history of movies. But what it did is it totally sabotaged him as an actual performer.
It's nobody's fault, maybe except my own. I didn't have final approval of the script, which means that I couldn't say this is not good for me.
I make us sad, make us sad.
And I think that he should embody that. It was early days for the kind of capitalism that has now run roughshod over almost all aspects of life because we as Americans put power and money ahead of all else. I mean, just to give you an example, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, the head of Amazon, he makes $1.2 million an hour. And Amazon didn't pay any federal tax in 2017. Once you know that, you understand how dangerously and destructively the beast of capitalism has been allowed to run roughshod in the garden of this democracy. Because with that kind of economic power and with that kind of disparity of power, of course comes a disparity over control over the levers of power in a society. So I don't have the same control over American life that Jeff Bezos has, and I don't pretend to. And the average person never will have any kind of control over American life like that. And that is not of the people, by the people, for the people. That sounds a lot more like we already had with the King of England. And it's the return to that, which is what capitalism threatens in the modern era, is a return to that kind of imbalance of power.
Oh my God, like the King, like the title of your film. I mean, in a way, it's a weird thing that's happening in America. We were supposed to resist this idea of kings and queens and that sort of thing, but we made Elvis the king.
To get up and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies. The world is a college of corporations. The world is a business. I have chosen you to preach this election.
I spend my day peppering America overseas. Pension for the workers, nigga, please. Embezzlement, etiquette, private settlement. I'm better with Confederate rhetoric from my mansion in Connecticut. Foreclosure Vic hoes out the tenement. I twist words like a speech impediment. I hope you got good credit, bitch. If not, better get a new job with benefits. While I play golf with niggas and get cheddar with. New money buys brand new carrots. My old money bought your great grandparents. You got grills in your mouth, I ain't mad at you. I own every gold mine in South Africa. Thanks, baby, you made me $1 billion. Plus I own a building for each one of my children's children. That's the shit. Snort coke in the whip, Miss USA sucking my dick. Yeah, what? Fuck the law, cause real jailers for suckers. I go to country club prison, you dumb motherfuckers. I am the 1% fucking bitches, yeah.
And then what happened to him? He ended up, this celebrated image of America ended up bloated and coked up and dead on a toilet. And I gotta ask you, Eugene, after this experience, after your travel through America with this car, after all this stuff, what can we do as America? We are one. We are responsible for Trump. We are responsible for all these things. And I feel like a lot of us, you know, we want to be tribalistic, like, oh, I didn't do this. I'm not those people. I'm not that people. You know, we're not carrying the tiki torches in Charlottesville, but we are a unit. If we're going to say anything, we are a country. What can we do to avoid a demise similar to the King?
Well, I think we're watching that happen in a lot of ways. I mean, the current president, so-called, he is a person who has demonstrated to the American people such a severe departure from anything that could be considered morally defensible in American leadership. He's a proud racist, sexist. He's abusive of people. He's abusive of his power. I think he takes delight in the misery of others, if one is to judge from the television show that made him so famous. And when you see that in a person, it's shocking, horrifying, and it looks like the end of the world. But look what's happened on his watch. We have seen the birth of some of the most significant social movements in my lifetime in counter-reaction to him, out of disgust at what he represents. We've seen Time's Up, Me Too, the Poor People's Movement, the Sanctuary Cities movement by mayors, the students of Parkland staring down the NRA, one of the most evil institutions in American history. You've seen teachers in red states striking to get better conditions for those who educate our children. I mean, for crying out loud, you saw Wonder Woman and Black Panther, demonstrations of a passion that the public has to see a kind of equality that this president and his administration and his friends in Congress do not respect and do not think is the future of America.
YouTube edit.
I think the Americans by majority are speaking that they don't like this direction. The current administration is very good at propaganda and they're very good at working the airwaves, but you can't bully truth, and this is a loser of a presidency. And it's ranked that way historically. It's a laughingstock of the world. It's achieved nothing except the prospect of a slanted Supreme Court. So its one claim to fame at the moment is that it has a chance of eradicating the separation of powers that the founders made as the cornerstone of this republic. That's not a great auspicious achievement, if you ask me, but in response to it, we're watching incredible forces of engagement happening. The question we have to ask ourselves, in the same conversation where we ask if Elvis stepped up enough when it was up to him, is, are we stepping up enough? Are we watching Emma Gonzalez and her comrades on TV stand up for their fallen comrades at that school? Are we watching her living up to her example? Are we doing in our own space what she is doing with her space, with what she has in front of her? And if we aren't, then we're not part of the solution. And if we can figure out how to do that, it means figuring out in your life where the pressure points are, where you can throw yourself and your circle of friends and family and acquaintances and your orbit of power, where you can throw that into the gears of a machine and prevent it from operating. That's the whole question of our time right now. I think that's going to be the question over the next couple of years as we play out how this chapter unfolds and what role this particularly pernicious moment in American history will play in the future of our lives. But we play as big a role as anybody else, each of us.
YouTube edit. It seems so cliche and simple, but I gotta ask, man, I mean, after all this time, you've been studying Elvis. I mean, you lived in his car for all this time. You know what I mean? Like, Jesus.
Yep.
What's your favorite song?
I think at the end of the day, the film's closing song is the one that I think contains the greatest pathos in how I think about Elvis and how I think about America. There are songs I like of Elvis along the way that are poppier. There are songs like Heartbreak Hotel and like, his version of Blue Moon that I really find eerie or cool or period. But there's nothing that quite captures, I think, the enormous reach and impact of Elvis and his impact on America, like his cover of the Righteous Brothers song, Unchained Melody. He does the song in the film, and it's shortly before he's going to die. And it has that feeling of destiny in it. And there's a certain tragedy in it. And his voice is soaring like some angel and devil are warring in his soul for airtime and to reach the public and to reach the world with who he is and what he wants to say. What I think happens in that song is a heartbreaking display of a broken and lost and compromised country boy who has found himself trapped in the body of a bloated king, a bloated, sequined, kind of emasculated royal figure who never quite got his way back to Tupelo. He's lost in transit. He's up on that stage almost babbling incoherently, but then he sets down, and what comes out of his fingers and his mouth at the piano and in his voice is monumental. And it reminds you of a couple of things. At a personal level for Elvis, it reminds you there's sort of a beautiful moment when he looks in the camera and he has this boyish, beautiful smile trapped in all that madness. And it reminds you that he's still there and that he knows better and that it must be so heartbreaking for him to have that prodigious talent and that voice and that spirit of an angel tormented by demons. And yet, at the same time, he can't get out. He can't get free of the life that's crushing him. And I think where that's even more significant is how it speaks about the American people ourselves, who I think ourselves are trapped in a life we no longer recognize, in a transmogrified reality that I don't think we know how to process. Really in a quite profound way, when he looks up at the camera at the very end of the film and his eyes settle right on ours, I feel like he's looking right into me, and he's looking right in on behalf of the American people themselves to say we're still here. We just have to kind of refine this flame that we have deep in here and and harness it for good. And it didn't happen for Elvis. He was too little, too late. He didn't get around to saving himself. If I could have been there and loved him and known him, I would have tried to save him. And likewise, my job is to do that with the American story, because I tell stories in my films, and if they remind us of what's valuable to us, it's one way of going back to basics and trying to find your way again.
You think America's going to pull this off? You think we're going to be okay in the end?
It's a global question. I think America has been a leader among some level of equals in the world, and the question is whether America will find her way back to being a member of the community of nations. And then the question becomes, what does the community of nations do with clear survival problems that the human race faces? And so America is simply making matters worse at the moment. But even if we fixed ourselves, that only qualifies us to then fight the battle that the world has to fight of a sustainable future. But we are blowing day by day the desperately needed time for global cooperation, because we aren't acting as a unifier. We aren't being a leader among equals. We're being a follower, frankly, of more powerful regimes, and we are leading the world only in malice, in corruption, in hatefulness, in deception, and in the incredible capacity to waste time with spectacle that should be spent on meaning and substance and family and closeness and mindfulness.
Eugene, I really appreciate this, and thank you for your time today, sir.
Of course, man. Thank you.
Have a good evening.
You too.
This content has been edited by YouTube. Find the full unedited version at therighttoreason.com. Thank you to Eugene Jarecki, and thank you to Leanne Russell for making this happen. Thank you to David Blair at davefreesong.com/free music. Thank you for listening. This episode was brought to you by our patrons. You can support the broadcast at patreon.com/right and learn more at therighttoreason.com. Next week, we'll be talking to activist, podcast host, speaker, and author Aaron Ra about all things religion, education, and politics. That's next week. Between now and then, you have the right to reason.